The Mayflower, a ship braving the Atlantic in 1620, carrying a band of brave souls we now call the Pilgrims. They were headed for the New World in search of freedom, but why were they on that ship to begin with? Why risk everything, home, family, and life itself, to cross an unforgiving ocean? Today we're diving deep into the real reasons the Pilgrims left England, and it's a story of religious strife, underground congregations, foreign exile, and a desperate hope for a future that didn't yet exist. And of course, we're going to look into what they had to eat aboard the Mayflower. The food situation slowly got worse for a number of reasons, which we're going to get into. But they did have a pretty good provision list. They had beer, salted pork, hardtack, some cheeses, dried peas and beans, and dried fish, to name a few things. Today, I will be recreating hardtack, aka ship's biscuit. For this, you will need 4 cups of flour, and I needed about 1 1/4 cup of water. Start slowly incorporating the water into the flour. Start with about half a cup, and get that all mixed in. You don't have to use all of the water, just enough to get it together. The less water we use, the better, as we're trying to dry these suckers out. Then you want to knead it for about 10 to 15 minutes. Now, just separate the dough into the size you prefer and flatten them out to about ½ inch thick. And then poke a bunch of little holes in the top so they don't puff up in the oven. Now bake it at 300 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 hours. Take it out, let it cool, and then put it back in at 200 degrees for another 2 to 3 hours. It seems excessive, but we're really trying to dry these out and draw as much moisture out as possible. We want these things to survive a nuclear winter, essentially. So while those are cooking, let's rewind to the late 16th century England, a country caught in religious upheaval. The Protestant Reformation had already shaken Europe for nearly a century, but in England, the dust hadn't settled yet. In 1534, King Henry VIII broke away from the authority of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church. Through the Act of Supremacy, Parliament recognized Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England, marking the official beginning of the English Reformation. However, while the Church of England was Protestant in name, many reformers believed it retained far too many Catholic practices. By the late 1500s, a group known as the Puritans emerged. They wanted to purify the Church of England of remaining Catholic rituals and hierarchy. Patrick Collinson, a leading historian on Puritanism, writes in the Elizabeth Puritan movement that Puritans saw the English Church as halting halfway in the Reformation. Now within the Puritans, an even more radical sect appeared, the Separatists. These people believed that the Church of England was beyond redemption. Separatists believed that true Christians must form independent, self-governing congregations without the king or bishops. The most famous of these separatist groups gathered in Scrooby, Nottinghamshire, in the home of William Brewster, one of the senior elders on the Mayflower. Now, practicing religion outside the Church of England, that was illegal. Under Queen Elizabeth I, laws against unauthorized religious meetings called conventicles were strictly enforced. Offenders could be fined or imprisoned. The 1593 Act against Puritans made it a felony to attend underground religious gatherings. The separatists in Scrooby faced constant threat, and in 1607 they tried to flee to Holland, a Protestant haven with relative religious tolerance. Their first attempt failed, but the second attempt in 1608 did succeed, and they arrived in the Dutch city of Leyden. Leyden was a safe haven, but life there was hard. The English separatists in Leyden were mostly poor. They took on back-breaking labor working as weavers, cloth makers, or in printing houses. The children also grew up in a Dutch culture. The older generation feared they were losing their language, culture, and religious fervor. Bradford was worried that their children, because of these circumstances and the wild behavior of young people in that country, were being led astray by bad influences and getting involved in reckless and dangerous behavior. So, they had fled one culture they couldn't tolerate, only to find themselves losing their identity in another. It was time for a bold new move. And that's where we come to the trip to the New World. In 1617, discussions began in earnest among the Leyden congregation. Should they leave Europe entirely? They believed the New World could offer both religious freedom and cultural preservation, but they needed funding and permission. The Pilgrims secured patents from the Virginia Company in 1619 and 1620, giving them permission to settle within its territory, although neither of them mattered as they became void when the Pilgrims landed outside the Virginia Company's jurisdiction. It wasn't until 1621 that they secured a valid patent from the Council for New England, legitimizing their settlement at Plymouth. They also formed a partnership with English investors, known as the Merchant Adventurers. The investors agreed to finance the voyage in exchange for profits from whatever the colony produced, like fur, fish, lumber. Now, they just needed ships. Originally, there were two, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. The Speedwell was hired to take them from the Netherlands to England to meet up with the Mayflower. The two ships planned to sail together to northern Virginia. The Speedwell departed from Delft Haven on July 22nd and arrived at Southampton, where they found the Mayflower waiting for them. The Speedwell had been leaking on her voyage from the Netherlands to England, though, so they spent the next week patching her up. On August 5th, the two ships finally set sail for America, but Speedwell began leaking again. The ship absolutely does not want to make this trip. So they pulled into the town of Dartmouth for repairs, arriving there about August 12th. The Speedwell was patched up again, and the two ships set sail for America around August 21st. After the two ships had sailed about 300 miles out to sea, the Speedwell again, you guessed it, began to leak. Frustrated with the enormous amount of time lost and their inability to fix the Speedwell so that it could be seaworthy, they returned to Plymouth, England, and made the decision to leave the Speedwell behind. Thank goodness. The Mayflower would go to America alone. The cargo on the Speedwell was transferred over to the Mayflower. Some of the passengers were also so tired and disappointed with all the problems that they literally quit and gave up on the voyage and went home. Can't say I blame them on that. The Mayflower, just over 100 feet long, carried all 102 passengers. I can't help but think that had both ships been able to do the voyage, it would have ended up being a lot better of a trip. Anyway, on September 6, 1620, they finally departed Plymouth, England. On the Mayflower were both religious separatists who called themselves saints, and others the saints called strangers, who came for economic or other reasons. But what was life actually like aboard this cramped vessel? Well, the Mayflower was not a passenger ship for one. It was a cargo vessel, and it was about 90 feet long and 25 feet wide. 102 passengers were crammed into the gun deck, also called the 'tween deck, a dark, damp area only about 5 feet high. To look at the layout of the ship, you may notice in the upper left you have the poop house. Actually, nothing to do with a bathroom. The poop house was the living quarters for the ship's master, and maybe some of the higher-ranking crew. That's lovely, ain't it? The cabin was the general sleeping quarters for the Mayflower's 20 or 30 crew members. The crew slept in shifts, so not everyone was sleeping in the room at the same time, thank goodness. There were no private cabins, no beds, just straw-filled mattresses on the bare wooden floor. The voyage took 66 days, much longer than expected, and during those 66 days, passengers faced seasickness, brutal storms, cold temperatures, and a serious shortage of appetizing food. The food loaded onto the Mayflower had to last the voyage and beyond, since there would be no farms or markets in the New World. Like I mentioned earlier, beer was included in the daily rations because it was safer to drink than potentially stagnant water stored in barrels. This was common for the time period, and yes, even the kids drank beer. This would have been a barely alcoholic beer, though. Storms battered the ship and water frequently leaked in, soaking bedding and food supplies. Mold and spoilage were inevitable. Bradford describes a massive storm mid-voyage that cracked the main beam. There was no proper ventilation, the smell was unbearable, seasickness swept the passengers, and worse, disease began to spread. By the time the Mayflower reached Cape Cod in November 1620, many passengers were already sick with scurvy, pneumonia, or other illnesses. While fresh vegetables were nearly impossible to bring along, they did bring some dried or preserved items. The laden congregation reportedly prepared some foods in advance, including hard Dutch cheeses and dried fruits like raisins or prunes. Jeremy Bangs notes in Strangers and Pilgrims that Dutch markets allowed access to preserved goods that might have been unavailable in England. So that was definitely something to be thankful for. When the Mayflower finally landed, of course, hundreds of miles north of their intended destination, they faced the winter without established homes or crops. The fight to stay alive began immediately, and from December 1620 to March 1621, nearly half the passengers and crew died. Bradford reports that by spring only about 50 people remained, and what little food they had was rationed tightly, and during this time, the settlers resorted to what they could scavenge: shellfish, nuts, and whatever game they could hunt. Eventually, they were aided by local Wampanoag tribes, especially Squanto, who taught them to plant corn and forage. This would help lead to the first Thanksgiving the following autumn. But, in the meantime, let's see how our own hardtack turned out. Alright, here's our hardtack that we made. I got a couple pieces right here. And I've just got some soup, vegetable soup, that I'm going to break this up and let it set in here for about 10 minutes probably. Let it regain some moisture, and then I'll try it. I'm just crumbling it up right now as best I can. Alright, our ship's biscuit has been setting in this soup for about 10 minutes. Hopefully softening up so that I don't break my teeth on it. Let's give it a try. Here's some right here. Still kind of hard. So this really is true survival food because it does not taste good at all. It's got a very bland flavor to it, which makes sense because it's just flour and water and then cooked. Well, that's it for me, and I hope you guys enjoyed another episode of A Fork in History. I have a challenge for you all to make your own chips biscuit and then keep it around and just see exactly how long it will last. Who knows, it may last another 30 years before it goes bad.